Hello, students, U.S. history students. How's it going? This is a recorded lecture. It'll be a relatively short lecture. If you recall, last class, I said that I wanted to finish up the Civil War, our Civil War discussion and lectures, so that we could get on to Reconstruction and how the U.S. really recovers from the disaster that was the Civil War. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, I did not get through all of it. Shocker, right? So today I'm just going to finish up the last couple minutes of our lecture, our notes, our slides for the Civil War. We'll be going through them rather quickly just so we can get an overview of these things. Again, I'm not going to be focusing on the specific battles necessarily or the specific tactics or anything like that. It's going to be more on the cultural shifts, the reasons the South eventually fell. Spoiler alert, if you didn't know that already, it's the reason you're in my class, right? So we'll be going over that today. It should be relatively quick, just as a reminder. Make sure to pause it if you need, take notes when you're listening to this. If you don't have it in front of you already, make sure to pause me and go grab a piece of paper and pencil for your notebook to take down these notes, because this is important stuff. This is the most deadly conflict in American history on American soil. So really, really important stuff. And yeah, make sure to, if I'm talking too slow, speed me up, slow me down, pause me, rewatch me, anything you need to do to understand this material. Okay. But with that being said, let me pull up the slides real quick and we will get started here. Okay, just as a quick reminder, what we left off talking about yesterday, we left off talking about these international relations. Now, this is something that is not really discussed very much when we're talking about the Civil War, but it was a huge, huge factor in the shifting of the Civil War, or more letting the North continue and start gaining some momentum, some sort of victory. So as a quick reminder, the blockade, which you see there in that black dotted line, the North had blockaded all of Southern trading coming out of the South, mainly cotton, to Europe. Now, England and France relied on this cotton for their textile industry, for their mills across the sea. And so, naturally speaking, France and England were suffering quite a bit from this war. And so they discussed joining the war on the South purely for economic reasons, because they wanted that flow of cotton to start continue, right? Now, if France and England had joined, Lincoln would have been a huge, huge bind, right? He could barely fend off the South, which was a much smaller force than before, because as we talked about last class, the Northern generals, the Northern Army was very unopportunistic, we'll say, while the South had great generals like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, who were winning many victories who many believed they should not have. So Lincoln needed a reason to keep Europe out of the war, right? And so, as we discussed and we read for, I think 2 weeks ago now, we read the Emancipation Proclamation was was issued. Now, this is not directly the only reason, not the only reason that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, but it was one of the many reasons it was issued, was to make the war more about morals. Remember, up to this point, Lincoln had been primarily focusing on the preservation of the Union, what we call, right? The preservation of the Union. So making sure the South stays with the North and you have one nation. That was his main goal. But now he needs another thing to keep France and England out of the war. And so he starts just to make the war a little bit more about slavery as well. Starts to talk about it in moralistic terms, of good versus evil. And because of this, because he knows England and France have already outlawed slavery by this time, and so their people would not allow them to go to war to keep slavery, more or less, or go to war on a pro-slavery side. now that this issue has come up and now that it's starting to seem like this war is more about slavery than anything else. Really, really shrewd move by Lincoln there. As we recall, Lincoln is not, he's anti-slavery, but he's more anti the expansion of slavery than anything. Before coming into the presidency, he talked about how slavery was immoral, but the president didn't have any jurisdiction to outlaw slavery or to ban slavery. So he was okay with slavery continuing in the certain states as long as it was not expanded to further states. At this point, now he starts to really crack down against this slave agenda in the South. Okay, so that's all recap last week. So real quick, right? When you get to 1863, there's a stalemate going on. The South economics are failing. The people in the South are starting to get mad. In the North, there's failing morale, right? The people, famously in New York, they refuse to start sending men down to the southern border to help in the war effort. And one of the main turning points we talked about at this time, now that this idea of moralism is starting to creep up into the Civil War, is that Lincoln starts allowing Black men to start serving in active military roles. Before this, they were doing more manual labor roles and sometimes, but now they're given guns, put in the battlefield, and they start to actually interact in the war for a positive way. Along with this, there's two confiscation acts that are passed in the Senate, which allow all fugitive slaves to be free. If they're and all slaves who are captured by the Union, if they join the war, are now free as well. This goes in direct conflict with the Fugitive Slave Act a couple of years prior to this, which said that any escaped slave from the South had to be returned to the South, right? So this is in direct attack against those signed about 15 years earlier, if I'm not mistaken. So General Lee is hanging out in Northern Virginia at this time, right? So he needs to move north through Pennsylvania. His idea is, remember, he tried this once before. His idea is to take DC and therefore force the end of the war. The South is really, really struggling economically, so Lee thinks of one last stand to try to take DC and force the end of the war. And so his plan, as you see here, is to do a little loop from Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania and down then through Maryland into Washington, D.C., which we see right here. And you might be thinking, well, Mr. Tibbets, it'd be a lot quicker to just go right to D.C., right? But his goal is to avoid the Army of the Potomac by going around them. Now, this doesn't exactly work, and his army is met in the southern Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. I'm sure you've heard of Gettysburg before. They meet in Gettysburg, and we're not going to go over. It's a famous, famous battle. There's plenty of videos on YouTube to look at the tactics of it. But the moral of the end of the battle, more or less, is that it's a massive victory for the Union. Tons of bloodshed on both sides, but in the end, it's a massive victory for the Union, and they keep the South out of Washington, D.C. So while this is happening, very soon after this is happening, remember we talked about the anaconda approach to the North, where they surround and then squeeze in, just like an anaconda does, right? So while Lee's army is getting defeated in the North, over all the way in the West, by the Mississippi River, remember they're trying to cut off Texas from the rest of the South. The Mississippi River is finally taken by the North around this same time. So they have two major victories that are really starting to change the idea of the war. Lincoln at this time gives his famous Gettysburg Address, which I'm sure you've heard, the 20 years ago, which was not even the main address of that day. It was a very short address, which you guys have read. But it's really a morale booster for the Union to keep the fight going now that they're starting to get some victories. Again, this moralistic idea comes into play with the Gettysburg Address. So the Union begins to break through. So I have a map here. This map isn't perfectly correct, but this is more or less the the territories of the South and the North at this time. A couple differences, right? West Virginia is kind of breaking off. Kentucky and Missouri are mainly north. And so I'll show you this breakthrough of the North coming through. The North will be shown in green, coming through into the South and how they eventually take control of the South. So to go to this next one, we see here all the green that is highlighted is the Northern victories at this time. You see they take the Mississippi River, so they've split the South in two, effectively knocking Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas out of the war at this point. And now they can continue their Anaconda approach and just squeeze the rest of this cotton belt until they eventually collapse. And so this is exactly what they do, led by General Sherman at this time. So Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, is primarily in charge at this time. He's not quite the general yet, but he's over in the north by Virginia at this time, while another General Sherman, with the help of Grant, has this idea. His idea is, up to this point, they had been primarily taking city by city. So city hopping is what it's called. They go from city to city, taking that land, and then the surrounding land kind of falls with it. But General Sherman has this idea, it's called the Sherman Plan, of why not just take the land surrounding the city, and then eventually the cities will cave. And so this is what they start doing around Georgia, and I'll show that right here. So this little green area, their idea, instead of surrounding and having a siege of Atlanta, they decide to just take all of the farmland of Georgia, avoiding the major cities, taking all the farmland, all the supplies, living off the land, and eventually the cities will cave. This is exactly what happens. So they destroy most of Georgia in the process, taking all the plantation land, freeing all the slaves as they go. And then once they've taken Georgia, they turn up to South Carolina. Remember, the South Carolina is the first state to secede. They do a lot of brutal battles during this time in South Carolina, eventually take South Carolina into North Carolina and trap Lee in Virginia with Lee's last stand, where he eventually surrenders to Grant. So Grant, U.S. Grant, as he's called, is the new general of the North. And if there's one thing we know about the Northern generals at this point, is they've been super conservative up to this point. That's not the case anymore. Grant is the complete opposite of a conservative. He's full on charge ahead. That's what he's known for. And he's super, super aggressive. And so he and General Sherman have this idea that we just discussed, this idea of, instead of taking cities, they take the land, demoralize the people. And so they do this by taking Georgia, South Carolina, eventually North Carolina, and trap General Lee in Virginia, where Lee eventually surrenders to Grant. Interestingly enough, when Lee goes to Grant's tent to, actually it's not a tent, it's more of a house, goes to Grant's dwelling to surrender, once he surrendered, the Union soldiers start clapping in victory because they know the war is over. Grant, out of respect for Lee, hushes his soldiers, tells them to stop clapping so that Lee can leave in peace and dignity, because he knew how hard of a concession it was for General Lee, this great military strategist, to surrender and effectively end the ideals of the South, so we'll call it. Lee was much more, he was pro-Virginia. He wasn't necessarily pro-South. He was pro-slavery, but he was pro-Virginia. And he really chose, he had a hard time choosing between the North and the South, but he chose the South primarily because he loved, and he still identified with, his hometown, or his home state of Virginia this time. So the war is over. Great. The war is over. The Civil War is finally done. Look at these two pictures. These are two pictures of a young Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln right after the end of the Civil War. Lincoln's really, really tired, if you haven't noticed already, right? He is exhausted by the Civil War. His entire presidency has been dealing with a literal split in his Union when he just wants peace. Once the war is ended, he remarks to his wife that he's very tired. He says, "I'm very tired, but I'm excited to," more or less, I'm paraphrasing, more or less, "I'm excited to lead a free and peaceful nation at this time." That night, he goes to a play. It's a comedy play. He seems to be enjoying it quite a lot, and he never leaves that theater. It's Ford Theater because he's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in the theater, and he just months after the end of the Civil War. And down goes one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. Okay, so kind of the final stats of the war, if we're looking at it, like I said, it's the most destructive war in American history by far. 750,000 casualties, American casualties from both the North and the South. If we look at the splits between the North and the South, about 290,000 Confederates died, while 365,000 Union died. Interesting, the North had many more die than the South, but remember, the North had a lot more people at this time, about 23 million to the South's 6 million at this time. Huge amounts of casualties. This includes about 50,000 civilians, people who had no part in the war, women, children, people who were neutral, and also about 80,000 slaves at this time. Huge, huge losses of death. And interestingly enough, we kind of get desensitized to the numbers in war. But to give you an idea of just how many people died in the Civil War, more people died, more Americans died in the Civil War than in the American Revolution, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined, right? That is huge. Now, not total numbers of dead, but total numbers of Americans. More died in the Civil War than all of those wars combined. Huge, huge effects that this war had on the American people, the economics that will come forth, and the reconstruction that will occur after this Civil War has ended. And that concludes the rest of my lecture on the Civil War. When I see you all next, we will be discussing the Reconstruction. How does America recover from all this? So that's what we'll be discussing next week. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me, email me, talk to me in class, talk to me after class. I would love to answer any questions anyone have. If I didn't cover anything, or if you have any questions about the lecture, that's why I'm here. That's what I get paid for. That's what I love doing, right? I love to teach you guys and to see those questions that come up naturally with these types of conversations. Okay. Like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I will see you again when we meet again. Have a great rest of your day. Make sure to take good notes, and I will see you all later.